He walked into the saloon to drink alone. He hadn't counted on her, and he sure as hell hadn't counted on the three men cornering her like coyotes around a lost lamb. The town was Bitter Creek, a place you ended up when you'd run out of road. Jake Sullivan had run out of road 5 years ago. He was a man with a jagged scar on his face and a war in his memory that never ended. He came here to be a ghost, to be left alone. But some things won't leave a man be. The woman stood with her back to the bar, straight as a church spire, but you could see the exhaustion in her shoulders. Her dress was worn, her face was beautiful, but haunted. She looked like she'd been running for 1,000 miles and had just hit a wall. Bill Hutchkins, a man who smelled as bad as his reputation, was leaning into her space. His two friends were blocking her in. "A pretty thing like you shouldn't be drinking alone," Bill slurred. His hand reached for her arm. "Let old Bill buy you a real drink." Her voice was steady, but Jake heard the tremor hiding underneath it. "I said no, thank you. Please leave me be." Bill just laughed, a sound like rocks grinding in a dry creek bed. "Hear that, boys? She's proper." His hand was about to touch her. That's when Jake heard his own voice, cold and quiet in the suddenly silent saloon. "The lady asked to be left alone." He hadn't meant to speak. He hadn't involved himself in anyone's trouble since the war. But something about the pride in her tired eyes had pulled the words out of him. Bill turned, his bloodshot eyes struggling to focus. "This ain't your concern, stranger." Jake took a step forward. His hand wasn't on his gun, but it was close. Close enough. "I'm making it my concern." The whole saloon held its breath. The bartender started quietly moving bottles off the bar top. Bill's friends took a half step back. They saw what Bill couldn't through his whiskey haze. They saw the look in Jake's eyes. It was a look that said he'd killed before, and that he'd sleep just fine after doing it again. For a long, tense moment, the air was thick with the promise of violence. Then Bill spat on the floor by Jake's boots and turned away. "Ain't worth it," he muttered. "Just another used-up dove trying to act respectable." They shuffled out, leaving a trail of curses behind them. Jake didn't move until the door stopped swinging. Then he turned to the woman. "You all right, ma'am?" She looked at him with eyes the color of dark coffee, and there was no gratitude in them. Only suspicion. "I didn't ask for your help." "No, ma'am, you didn't," Jake said, touching the brim of his hat. He started to turn away, to go back to being a ghost, but her voice stopped him. "Wait." He looked back. She seemed to be fighting with herself. "Thank you," she finally said. "It's been a long journey." She was from back east, Missouri. She didn't offer any more than that, and Jake didn't ask. Out here, everyone's past was their own business. "You got people here?" A sad smile touched her lips. "No people anywhere now." Jake knew that kind of alone. He signaled the bartender. "2 whiskeys, Sam. The good stuff." Her name was Grace Porter. She sipped the whiskey like it was poison, then coughed. "I'm not much of a drinker." Jake nursed his own glass, feeling the eyes of the other men in the saloon. A lone woman was a curiosity. A lone woman drinking with the town hermit was a scandal. "Those men," Grace said quietly, staring into her glass. "They were right about one thing. A woman alone out here." She didn't need to finish. Jake had already tried to send her to the boarding house, but Mrs. Chen had turned her away. No references, no family. In a town like Bitter Creek, that meant only one thing, and it didn't matter if it was true. "How long since you ate?" he asked. She hesitated, pride fighting a losing battle with hunger. "Yesterday, maybe the day before." Jake stood up without a word and walked out. He came back a few minutes later with a cloth bundle. "Sam's wife makes extra biscuits for me sometimes," he said gruffly. "There's ham, too." Her hands shook as she unwrapped it. She tried to eat slowly with dignity, but hunger was a wild animal. Jake looked away, giving her a moment of privacy. When she was done, she asked him the question he'd been asking himself. "Why are you helping me?" Jake thought for a long time. "Maybe because you didn't cry," he said. "Most would have." She wrapped the last biscuit in the cloth. "Tears don't change anything. They just make you look weak." The saloon was getting crowded. The whispers were getting louder. Jake could feel Grace's discomfort growing. "I should go," she said, standing up. "Where will you go?" She lifted her chin, but he could see the fear in her eyes. I'll find somewhere. Jake knew what that meant. An alley, a shed, a cold night under the stars in a threadbare dress. He made a decision that surprised even him. I've got a cabin, 2 miles north of town. There's a lean-to. It's not much, but it's shelter. Her eyes widened. I couldn't. People would talk. Jake gestured at the room full of staring faces. People are already talking. At least at my place, you'd have a roof. He met her gaze, letting her see he wasn't lying. He wanted nothing from her. All right, she whispered. They walked out into the cold desert night. The stars looked like chips of ice in the black sky. Jake helped her onto his horse and led it on foot. The only sound was the crunch of hooves on dry earth. The cabin was a simple, solid box of logs and mud. He lit a lantern, revealing a sparse room. A bed, a table, a stove. It was clean. It was safe. He built a fire while she stood by the door, wrapped in a silence as thick as the darkness outside. I'll get my bedroll from the stable, he said. He was almost out the door when her voice, small and trembling, stopped him cold. Can I sleep beside you, cowboy? The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Jake froze, his hand on the door latch. He turned slowly. In the flickering lantern light, he saw her shivering, not just from the cold. I don't mean, she stammered, wrapping her arms around herself. I haven't felt safe in so long. I just don't want to be alone. Not tonight. He saw a weariness in her that went bone deep, the look of a soul that had been running forever. He recognized it because he saw it in the mirror every single morning. The question hit him like a physical blow, shattering the walls he'd spent years building around his heart. It wasn't improper. It was human, and it was the most dangerous thing he'd heard in a long, long time. He stood there, caught between the man he was and the man the war had made him. The wind howled outside, a lonely sound that echoed the emptiness inside him. He finally closed the door, the click of the latch sounding like a judgment. I'll make a pallet on the floor, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. You take the bed. Her shoulders slumped in what looked like disappointment, but she nodded. He pulled blankets from a trunk, the silence stretching between them. There's a nightshirt in the drawer, he said without looking at her. It'll be too big, but it's clean. When she came from behind the hanging blanket she used as a screen, the shirt swallowed her whole. She looked younger, more fragile. Jake, she said as he banked the fire, why do you live out here alone? The question was quiet, but it landed hard. He thought about not answering. A man does things in a war, he said slowly, his back still to her. Things that change him. It's better to keep that kind of man away from decent folk. What things? Things that make him wake up swinging a fist, thinking he's still there. She moved closer, her bare feet silent on the wood floor. Is that how you got the scar? He touched it without thinking. No, that came from trying to protect people who didn't want protecting. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. But you did it anyway, he grunted. Fool habit. She got into the bed, pulling the blanket to her chin. He settled on the floor. Just when he thought she was asleep, her voice came out of the darkness. I had a husband once, Henry Porter. He was 20 years older than me. My father owed him money. The old ugly story, a business deal with a young bride as the currency. He wasn't cruel, she whispered, just cold. Everything was a transaction. When he died of a fever, I thought I was free. Then his brother Samuel came to settle the estate. Jake tensed. This was the part of the story where things always got worse. Samuel said Henry had debts. He said the only way to pay them was if I married him. When I refused, he said he'd ruin my name. Tell everyone I was a wasteful wife who drove Henry to his grave. So you ran. With nothing but the clothes on my back, I'd rather starve free than live in another cage. Her voice was stronger now, laced with steel. Jake lay on his back, staring at the dark ceiling. Takes courage to choose uncertainty over security. Or foolishness, she said. Maybe they're the same thing. The silence settled again. He could hear her breathing evening out. Then she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry for what I asked. It wasn't proper. Jake's own voice was quiet. Nothing wrong with not wanting to be alone. We're not made for it. Then why are you? The question hung in the air. Because hurting someone you care about is worse than being lonely. He heard the soft pad of her feet on the floor. She was standing over him in the darkness. I'm not afraid of you, Jake Sullivan. You should be. But I'm not. She knelt, and her hand found his in the dark. Her touch was warm. When you stood up to those men, I saw protection in your eyes, not violence. His hand lay still in hers. Grace, go back to bed. I have spent months sleeping with one eye open, she whispered, jumping at every shadow. Tonight, for the first time, I feel safe. Is it so wrong to want to stay close to that feeling? He sat up, gently pulling his hand away. It's not about right or wrong. It's about what happens when the sun comes up and the world starts judging. Let them judge, she said, defiance in her voice. They judge me already for being a woman alone. What's one more mark against my name? It's not your name I'm worried about. You care what people think. No, he said, the admission torn from him. I care what I might do. Instead of going back to the bed, she settled on the floor beside his pallet, close enough for him to feel her warmth. Jake lay back down, every nerve aware of her presence. It was a sweet torture. Tell me about before the war, she said softly. Who were you? A bitter laugh escaped him. Son of a school teacher. Thought I'd be a pastor, save souls instead of taking them. What changed? The world changed. I joined up with the 1st Missouri, fought at Shiloh, Stones River, Chickamauga. The names were like stones in his throat. I killed so many men I lost count. Boys, mostly. Her hand found his again, and this time he held on. The last one. He couldn't have been more than 17. He made it to our line, and I shot him point blank. He just looked surprised. Called for his mama as he died. Jake's hand trembled in hers. That's when something inside me broke. After the war, I tried to go home, but I saw his face everywhere. So I left. Came out here where I couldn't hurt anyone else. You're not that man anymore, she said gently. Aren't I? Those men in the saloon tonight recognized what I am. A killer. I saw a man who protects those who can't protect themselves. Same skill, different reason, he said. She shifted closer, her shoulder brushing his. Or maybe you're punishing yourself for surviving. The fire died to embers. He thought the conversation was over. Then she whispered, I'll be gone in the morning, I promise. But tonight, thank you. He turned his head, and in the faint moonlight, he could see the curve of her lips. Where will you go? California, maybe. Somewhere to start fresh. It was a dangerous road. Apache, outlaws, the desert itself. There's work here, he heard himself say. A neighbor of mine, Tom Martinez. His wife died. He has 3 young children. People would talk, she said, about us. Let them, he said, surprising himself again. Why do you care what happens to me? He was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was almost too quiet to hear. Because you remind me that not everything in this world is broken. Without thinking, she leaned over and pressed her lips to the scar on his cheek. It was a touch as light as a moth's wing, but it burned through him. He went rigid. Then slowly, as if moving underwater, he put an arm around her. She didn't pull away. They just held each other in the darkness. 2 broken people finding a moment of shelter. For the first time in 5 years, Jake Sullivan didn't sleep alone. And for the first time in 5 years, he didn't have nightmares. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song across the plains. But inside the small cabin, something quiet and fragile had taken root, holding the darkness at bay. For now. Dawn crept into the cabin like a thief. Jake woke with a start, disoriented by the warmth against his side. Grace had curled into him during the night, her hair smelling faintly of wood smoke. He carefully slipped away, pulling on his boots and heading outside into the sharp, clean air. He splashed icy water on his face from the well, trying to wash away the memory of her closeness. This was a mistake. Solitude was safe. This feeling, this connection. It was a complication he couldn't afford. When he returned, she was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to pin her hair with trembling fingers. Morning, he said, his voice gruff. I should go, she said, not meeting his eyes. Coffee first, he insisted, needing the simple task to keep his hands from shaking. That work I mentioned, it's real, Tom Martinez is a good man. People will assume things, she said, wrapping her hands around the tin cup of coffee he gave her. They assume things anyway, he replied. Might as well eat while they're talking. They ate in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. I'll ride to town, he said when they were done. Talk to Tom. You stay here. Rest. She nodded, then caught his sleeve as he turned to leave. Jake, last night. Nothing happened last night, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Two tired people shared some warmth. That's all. He didn't know if he was trying to convince her or himself. The ride to town felt different. Every hoofbeat echoed the complication he was riding into. The town was already awake, and the looks he got were sharp and knowing. News traveled fast. He found Tom Martinez at the livery. Tom was a good man, with kind eyes and a face weathered by the sun. Jake, he said, wiping his hands on a rag, heard you had some excitement at the saloon. Heard you left with the lady. She needed help, Jake said. I'm sure she did, Tom said, his eyes serious. But people are talking. You know how it is. I came about work, Jake said, cutting to the chase. You still need help with your children? Tom's eyebrows shot up. For her? She's educated from back east. Your children need schooling. Tom hesitated. My Maria's only been gone 6 months, Jake. I'm not looking to replace her. Not about replacing. It's about help. A proper arrangement. Proper wages. Tom studied him for a long moment. You vouch for her? After one night? Jake's jaw tightened. I know she's running from something, but not the law. I know she's got pride, and I know she stood up to Bill Hutchkins with more backbone than most men I've ever met. Is that enough? Tom finally nodded. Bring her by this afternoon. I'll talk to her. He paused, his expression hardening slightly. But Jake, if this brings trouble to my children, it won't? You sound mighty sure for a man who met her yesterday, Tom said. Then he added a warning that chilled Jake to the bone. Be careful. A woman running from something sometimes means that something is following right behind. The warning echoed in Jake's head as he went to the general store. Mrs. Henderson, the owner's wife, took his money with pursed lips. Heard you had a visitor last night, she said, her voice dripping with disapproval. A decent woman wouldn't be traveling alone. Good thing I'm not a decent man then, Jake said, gathering his supplies. We match. Outside, he ran straight into Sheriff Ben Carter. Jake, the sheriff said, Bill Hutchkins is making noise. Says you pulled a gun on him. My hand never left my side. I know, Carter said, but Bill's got cousins. They don't take kindly to being shown up. Just watch your back. And maybe encourage your guest to move on. For everyone's sake. It was a polite threat. The town wanted the problem, the woman, the complication, to disappear. When he got back to the cabin, Grace had tidied the place. There was a wildflower in a tin cup on the table. The simple domestic touch felt like a punch to the gut. What happened in town? She asked, seeing the look on his face. Tom will see you this afternoon, he said, avoiding her eyes. And the rest of it? She pressed. What did they say about me? About us? I'm bringing you trouble, she said, and it wasn't a question. I've handled worse trouble than gossip. Have you? She asked, her gaze intense. When's the last time you had something to lose? The question hit him like a stray bullet. He turned away, pretending to be busy with the supplies. He had spent 5 years with nothing to lose. It had been his armor. Now, in less than a day, that armor had a crack in it, and her name was Grace. The Martinez Ranch was a modest, well-kept place. 3 small faces peeked from the window as they rode up. Tom came out, his expression carefully neutral as he helped Grace dismount. Mr. Sullivan says you need help with your children, Grace said, her voice steady despite her nerves. I need help with many things, Tom admitted, his voice rough with grief. But you understand, I'm not looking to replace my Maria. No one could, Grace said simply. But children need care. They need to learn. I can do that. Tom looked at her for a long time, then at the small, watching faces in the window. He nodded. Let's go inside. As they walked toward the house, Tom said to Jake, if I hire her, she's under my protection now. The meaning was clear. Jake's involvement ended here. It would only cause more talk, more trouble. Grace turned back as Jake mounted his horse. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." He rode away without looking back, but he could feel her eyes on him. That night his cabin felt cavernously empty. The wildflower on the table was already starting to wilt. He should have thrown it out, erased the last trace of her. Instead, he carefully added a little water to the cup. He lay on his bed, the faint scent of her still on the pillow, and stared at the ceiling. He had done the right thing. She was safe. She had a respectable job. He could go back to being a ghost. But as he lay there in the suffocating silence, he had a terrible feeling that he'd just given away the only thing that had made him feel alive in years. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that Tom Martinez was right. Something was following Grace, and it was only a matter of time before it found her. 3 weeks passed. An uneasy quiet settled over Bitter Creek. Jake fell back into his routine, but it was different. He found himself riding past the Martinez ranch more often than he needed to, catching glimpses of Grace with the children. Tom told him she was a natural. The little ones, especially the youngest Anna, adored her. The town's gossip died down to a low simmer. Jake told himself he was relieved. She was safe. That's what mattered. But every night, the silence in his cabin screamed at him. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday. Jake was mending a fence when he heard it, the sound of riders coming hard from town. It was Sheriff Carter, Tom Martinez, and a half-dozen other men. Their faces were grim. Trouble had finally arrived. "Jake!" Carter yelled, reining in his horse. "The Hutchkins gang hit town an hour ago. Bill and his cousins, plus some hired guns. 7 or 8 of them. They're holed up in the saloon," Tom added, his face pale, "demanding protection money. They asked for you, Jake. Said they had unfinished business." Jake felt the familiar cold seep into his bones. The cold of the battlefield. It was an old, unwelcome friend. "And that's not all," Tom said, his voice dropping. "Just before we rode out here, they were asking about Grace, asking where she was staying." The cold in Jake's veins turned to ice. It was never just about a drunken squabble in a saloon. It was about her. It had always been about her. Tom's warning came back to him. A woman running from something sometimes means that something is following right behind. The Hutchkins gang wasn't the something. They were just the dogs that had picked up the scent. Jake didn't hesitate. He moved toward his cabin, the townsmen watching as the quiet hermit disappeared, replaced by the soldier. He strapped on his gun belt, checked his Colt, and took his rifle from its pegs. The movements were economical, precise, deadly. "Stay behind me," he said as he mounted his horse. "Your job, Sheriff, is to get the innocent people off the street. I'll handle the Hutchkins boys." They rode for town, the thunder of hooves a drumbeat of impending war. Jake's mind was clear, focused. He saw the saloon in his mind. 2 doors, 3 windows, a second-story balcony. He cataloged the threats, the angles, the exits. But underneath it all, one thought pounded in his heart. Grace. They were asking for Grace. Bitter Creek looked like a ghost town. Doors were barred, streets empty. He could see movement behind the saloon windows. A rifle barrel glinted from the second floor. "They've got a man upstairs," Jake said quietly. "Another at the back. The rest will be inside." "What's the plan?" Carter asked. "The plan is, I'm going to walk in the front door and give Bill one chance to walk out." "That's suicide," Tom protested. 7 guns against 1. 8, Jake corrected, checking the rounds in his Colt. "And I've faced worse." He handed his rifle to Tom. "If I don't walk out of there, you'll find some papers in my cabin. Make sure Grace and the children get what's there." Before anyone could argue, he was walking across the street, his spurs the only sound in the dead-still town. He pushed through the saloon doors. The laughter inside died instantly. 8 men, all focused on him. Bill Hutchkins stood in the middle of the room, a whiskey bottle in one hand, a pistol in the other. "Well, well," he grinned, "the hermit comes to play." "I'm giving you one chance, Bill," Jake said, his voice dangerously calm. "Take your boys and ride out." "Or what?" Bill sneered. "You'll glare at us some more?" "Last time there was a lady present," Jake said, his hands hanging loose at his sides. "I'm not feeling so restrained today." One of the gunmen laughed, but it was a nervous sound. Something about Jake's absolute stillness was more terrifying than any threat. "You arrogant son of a—" Bill started to say, raising his pistol. He never finished. What happened next became a legend in Bitter Creek. They said Jake moved like lightning. They said he fired 5 shots from 5 different positions before the first body hit the floor. The truth was simpler. It was training. It was instinct. It was the brutal, efficient calculus of war. Jake's Colt cleared leather before Bill's gun was halfway up. The first shot took Bill in the shoulder, spinning him around. Jake was already diving, bullets tearing through the air where he'd been standing. His second shot dropped the man on the stairs. His third took out the gunman by the back door. He rolled behind a table as wood splintered around him. He didn't see his targets. He saw muzzle flashes. A man tried to flank him. Fourth shot. Another tried to run. Fifth shot. Then silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded. It had taken less than 30 seconds. 3 men were dead. 2 had their hands in the air. Bill Hutchkins was writhing on the floor. "Anyone else?" Jake asked. The 2 men shook their heads, terrified. "Get your wounded and get out," Jake said, already reloading. "If I see any of you in this territory again, I'll finish the job." The saloon doors burst open, and Carter and the others rushed in, stopping dead at the carnage. "Tom," Jake said without looking up, "you might want to check on your ranch." Tom's face went white. He turned and ran out of the saloon. Jake was right behind him. The questions about Grace hadn't been idle curiosity. This was never about protection money. They had come for her. They found Tom's foreman tied up in the barn, a bloody gash on his head. The house was ominously quiet. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he burst through the door, gun ready. The main room was a wreck. Furniture overturned, a clear sign of a struggle, but no blood. Thank God, no blood. Then he heard a muffled sound from the root cellar. He yanked open the door and found the 3 children huddled together, terrified but unharmed. The oldest girl, Rosa, was clutching a crumpled piece of paper. "Miss Grace told us to hide," she whispered, her eyes wide. "She said to give this to you." Jake took the note. Grace's handwriting was shaky. "They have me. Said it was your fault. Don't come after me. Take care of the children." The paper crumpled in his fist. The ice in his veins turned to fire. "How long ago?" he asked Rosa. She pointed to a spot in the sky where the sun had been. "Less than an hour. They had a head start, but they had a hostage. That would slow them down, and they were in his country now." Sheriff Carter arrived, breathing hard. "We can form a posse, get fresh horses." "No time," Jake said, already moving, gathering supplies. "They'll kill her if they see a posse coming. This has to be quiet." "You can't take them all on alone, not in open country," Carter protested. Jake turned, and the look in his eyes made the sheriff take a step back. "Watch me." At the door, Tom grabbed his arm. "Bring her back, Jake. Whatever it takes." Jake nodded once. He was already gone. The trail was easy to follow. They were moving fast but sloppy, heading for the Badlands, a maze of canyons where they could disappear. But Jake had tracked Apache through worse country than this. He pushed his horse hard, his world shrinking to the tracks in the dust, the bent blades of grass, the faint signs that told him he was gaining. The sun was setting when he finally saw them. 4 riders silhouetted against the crimson sky, and a flash of green. Grace's dress. She was tied to the lead horse. Jake dismounted, leaving his horse ground-tied. He moved along the canyon rim, silent as a ghost, the skills the Apache had taught him long ago coming back as if it were yesterday. They made camp by a small spring, confident they weren't being followed. That was their mistake. From his perch on the rim, Jake watched. 4 men left. One of them walked over to Grace, who was tied to a tree. He said something, and the others laughed. Grace responded by spitting at his feet. The man raised his hand to strike her. He never got the chance. Jake's rifle spoke from the shadows. The man spun and fell. Before the echo died, Jake had moved, firing again. The second man went down. The last 2 scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the canyon walls. "Sullivan!" one of them screamed. "Show yourself or the woman dies!" But Jake was already circling. a predator in the darkness. One of the men made a run for the horses. A single pistol shot dropped him in his tracks. Silence. Jake waited, counting to 100 before he emerged from the rocks. He moved through the camp, kicking weapons away from the bodies. Only then did he go to Grace. He cut her bonds with his knife, his hands surprisingly gentle. "I told you not to come," she said, her voice shaky. "Never was good at following orders," he replied, helping her to her feet. "Are you hurt?" "No, they wanted me alive. Bait," they said, "to draw you out." She looked around at the bodies lying in the twilight. "You killed them all." "Yes. For me." He met her gaze. "Yes." Something broke in her expression. She threw herself against him, her arms wrapping around his waist as if she'd never let go. He held her, his hand cradling the back of her head. "I was so scared," she whispered into his chest. "Not of dying, of never seeing you again." She pulled back to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" "Everything," he agreed. As they prepared to ride out, she caught his hand. "Jake, what you did, does it frighten you? What you became?" He looked at the violence surrounding them, the quiet bodies in the dust. "No," he said, his voice raw. "What frightens me is how easy it was. What frightens me is knowing I'd do it again in a heartbeat to keep you safe." She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but something that looked terrifyingly like understanding. "Maybe that's not something to be afraid of," she said quietly. "Maybe that's just love, looking like what it needs to in a hard world." As they rode out of the canyon of death, under a sky full of cold, distant stars, her words echoed in his mind. Love. It was a word he hadn't let himself think in a very long time, and it scared him more than all the guns in the territory. Their return to Bitter Creek was not the welcome he expected. The town was safe. The Hutchkins gang was gone. But the faces that watched them ride down the main street were filled with fear. Not of the gang, of him. Women hurried their children inside. Men watched from doorways, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and dread. At the Martinez Ranch, Tom rushed out, his relief at seeing Grace safe warring with the worry in his eyes. "Sheriff Carter wants to see you," he said to Jake. "There's been talk." Jake had known this was coming. He'd shown them the monster he kept chained up inside, and now they couldn't unsee it. "I'm going with you," Grace said, her chin set in that stubborn way he was beginning to know. "This concerns me. I won't hide while you face them for saving my life." They found the sheriff in his office with the mayor, the reverend, and a committee of the town's most important men. The air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Jake," Carter began, his voice carefully neutral, "we need to talk about what happened." "What's to talk about?" Jake said. "I cleaned up a mess you couldn't handle." "You call that a cleanup?" Mayor Aldrich sputtered. "That was a massacre. We're trying to build a civilized town here, not a butcher's yard." "Those men were killers and thieves," Grace shot back. "They kidnapped me." "Ma'am," said the Reverend Mills, his eyes cold, "your association with this man has brought nothing but violence to our town." "My association?" Grace's voice rose. "I was kidnapped because your town couldn't protect me." "A proper woman," came a voice from the doorway, Mrs. Henderson, of course, "wouldn't have been in a position to get kidnapped in the first place." "That's enough," Jake's voice cut through the room like a whip crack. "You want someone to blame, you blame me. But you leave her out of it." "That's the problem, Sullivan," the mayor said. "Your willingness to kill. We can't have a man like you living among us. It's not safe." "It was safe enough when you were begging me for help," Jake said, his voice dangerously low. "We asked for help, not a bloodbath," the Reverend insisted. Jake stood up. "Fine. You want me gone? I'll be gone by morning." "No," Grace said, standing beside him. "If he goes, I go." The room erupted. In the chaos, Jake looked at Grace, standing her ground for him, ready to take on the whole town. And he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he couldn't let her go. Sheriff Carter's whistle cut through the noise. "Enough! Jake, you did what you had to. But people are scared. They see you two together, and they see trouble." "We are together," Grace said quietly, and Jake's heart stopped. and I won't pretend otherwise to satisfy your hypocrisy." Mrs. Henderson gasped. "The scandal! What scandal?" Grace challenged, her voice ringing with defiance. "That a man protected a woman? That two lonely people found comfort in each other? The only scandal here is how quick you are to judge what you don't understand." She took a deep breath and faced the whole room. "You want the truth? Yes, I stayed in his cabin, on the floor, because I was terrified and he was kind. Yes, I have grown to care for him. And yes, I would rather be an outcast with him than be accepted by any of you." The silence was absolute. Then Tom Martinez, who had been listening from the doorway, spoke. "Seems to me Jake Sullivan saved this town, and Miss Grace saved my children from the grief that was eating them alive. If that's not civilized, Reverend, then I don't know what is." The blacksmith spoke up then, and the saloon owner, and the Mexican families Jake had always treated with respect. A slow tide began to turn in the room. "We just need assurances," the mayor said weakly, "that the violence is over." "I can't promise that," Grace said, "but I can promise to stand with this town, not against it." "And you, Sullivan?" the sheriff asked. "Can you go back to being the quiet man?" Jake looked at Grace and felt her hand slip into his. "No," he said. "I can't. I'm done hiding from the world. I'm done living like a ghost." The Reverend stood, his face pinched. "This is highly improper. Two unmarried people. Carrying on." "Then marry us," Jake said. The words were out before he'd even thought them. The whole room stared. Grace's hand tightened on his. He turned to her, his voice suddenly soft. "Grace, I'm not a good man. I'm broken in ways that might never mend. But I know I'd rather face this world with you than hide from it alone. If you'll have me." Tears filled her eyes. She touched the scar on his cheek. "Jake Sullivan, is that a proposal? It's a poor one. You deserve flowers and speeches." She put her fingers on his lips to quiet him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." The room exploded again, but this time with confused celebration. The Reverend sputtered about how irregular it was. "So is life out here?" Tom Martinez grinned. "I'll stand as witness." Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent, beautiful colors. They walked back toward the Martinez ranch, their hands locked together. "Did you mean it?" she asked quietly. "Or were you just trying to shut them up?" He stopped and turned her to face him. "I've never meant anything more in my life." He touched her face. "But you need to know what you're getting. I have nightmares. I'm not an easy man." "Neither am I," she said, a small smile on her lips. "I'm stubborn, and I have an unwomanly need to speak my mind." "I've noticed," he said, the corner of his own mouth twitching. "I like it." She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was their first real kiss, and it was tender and fierce and full of promises they hadn't yet learned how to make. As they walked on, the lights of the Martinez ranch glowing in the distance, he knew he was walking away from the ghost he'd been. He was walking toward a life. It would be a hard life, a dangerous one, but for the first time since the war, he wouldn't be walking it alone. The wedding was set for the next day at sunset. The whole town, caught up in the sudden romance of it all, pitched in. The Mexican women stayed up all night, sewing Grace a simple white dress. Tom Martinez offered to host a feast. It was all happening too fast, but for Jake, it couldn't happen fast enough. He stood by the makeshift altar outside the church, waiting for Grace. The setting sun bled across the horizon. Then he heard it, not the gentle music of a wedding, but the thunder of a single horse, ridden hard. A rider crested the hill, nearly falling from his exhausted mount. "Raiders!" he gasped. "Apache, 20 strong. They hit the Hernandez ranch at dawn. They're heading this way." A wave of fear washed over the wedding guests. Jake felt Grace's hand find his. Their new life was already under attack. The soldier took over instantly. "Get the women and children into the church. Men who can shoot, take positions," he commanded, his voice cutting through the panic. The mayor started to protest, but Sheriff Carter cut him off. "He's fought them before. We do what he says." As the town scrambled, Grace grabbed his arm. "We could run, Jake." "No," he said, his voice firm. "We don't run anymore. This is our home." Their wedding would have to wait. He organized the town's defenses, positioning the best shooters, planning for the worst. The sun touched the horizon, and they saw them, a line of painted warriors on swift ponies, a fearsome sight against the dying light. The Apache didn't charge. They circled the town, testing, probing. Then one warrior, older than the rest, rode forward. "White men!" His voice carried in the still air. "You have something that belongs to us." "What's he talking about?" Carter asked. Jake had a sinking feeling. "Search the town," he ordered. "Look for anyone hiding." They found her in a barn, a young Apache girl, terrified and wounded. The man who'd found her, Miguel Chavez, said she'd stumbled in that morning, and he couldn't turn her away. Jake knelt and spoke to her in the few words of Apache he knew. The story came out in halting pieces. She was the war chief's daughter, taken by slavers, sold to a brutal rancher named Garrison. She had escaped, been shot, and hidden in the first place she found. They weren't here to raid. They were here for her. "Then give her back," someone shouted, "before they kill us all." "Look at her," Grace said, her voice sharp. She had been tending the girl's wounds. "These are whip marks, burns. You want to send her back to that?" The town was divided. Jake knew there was only one way. "I'm going to talk to them," he said. He walked out into the no-man's land between the town and the warriors, his hands empty and open. "Your daughter is safe," he told the chief. "We didn't take her." "I know this," the chief replied in surprisingly good English. "The man Garrison who bought her, he still hunts her. We hunt him. Give her to us, and we will leave your town in peace." "And if she doesn't want to go?" A flicker of pain crossed the chief's face. "Then bring her. Let her choose." The town voted. It was a tense, angry debate, but in the end, Grace's passionate plea won out. "How can we call ourselves civilized if we hand a terrified girl back to her abusers?" They brought the girl out. She saw her father and ran to him, collapsing in his arms. The chief held her, his stoic face crumbling with relief. It seemed the crisis was over. But just as the Apache prepared to leave, a new group of riders appeared. Garrison and his men. A big, mean-looking man with cold eyes. "That's my property you've got there, Chief," Garrison drawled, his hand resting on his gun. "I've got a bill of sale." "She is Apache," the chief said. "Never property." Jake stepped between them. "She's under the protection of this town, Garrison. Ride out." Garrison sneered. "You're choosing savages over your own kind, Sullivan?" "We're choosing right over wrong," Grace called out from the church steps. "Something you wouldn't understand." For a second, the world held its breath. It was Garrison and his 6 men against the town. But then the Apache warriors quietly spread out, rifles ready, arrows nocked. Garrison's men looked nervously at the warriors, then at the armed townsfolk. The odds had shifted. "This isn't over," Garrison spat, wheeling his horse around. "I'll be back with the law." As he rode off, the Apache chief turned to Jake. "You have honor. Your town is now under Apache protection. Any who harm you, harm us." And then they were gone, melting into the twilight. In the stunned silence, Reverend Mills cleared his throat. "Well, I believe we have a wedding to finish." The ceremony resumed under the stars. This time there were no interruptions. When Jake kissed his bride, a cheer went up from the strange, battered, but united community. Later, he and Grace stood looking out at the desert. "Not exactly the wedding you dreamed of," he said. She laughed. "It was perfect," she said. "We didn't just marry each other tonight. We married this place, these people, for better or for worse." "For better or for worse," he agreed, pulling her close. Garrison would be back. The world was still a dangerous place. But for the first time, Jake Sullivan felt like he was on the right side of a war he might actually win. 3 months later, Garrison made good on his threat. Autumn had settled on the desert when the Apache scouts brought word. Garrison had gotten himself appointed a territorial deputy. He was coming back with a corrupt judge and 20 hired guns. And he'd put a $500 bounty on Jake's head, dead or alive. "He's coming for blood," Sheriff Carter said, his face grim. "Yours, Jake, but he'll burn the town to get to you." Grace stood beside Jake, her face pale but resolute. "We don't run," she said. "This is our home." The town had already decided. "We're not giving you up, Jake," Tom Martinez said. "Garrison wants a war. He'll get one." Jake looked at these men, shopkeepers, ranchers, his neighbors, willing to die for him. We don't fight them head on, he said, the old battlefield instincts kicking in. We make the cost too high. We make them bleed for every inch. As sunset approached, they saw the dust cloud of Garrison's riders. They made camp just out of rifle range, arrogant and confident. A rider came forward under a white flag. Garrison offers terms, he called out. Give up Sullivan, and the town goes unharmed. You have 1 hour. Tell Garrison to go to hell, Jake called back. The rider smiled. He thought you'd say that. He threw something into the dust. Jake picked it up. His blood ran cold. It was a small cloth hair ribbon stained with blood. That's from the Martinez girl, the rider said. Little Rosa. We picked her up on our way here. Sweet little thing. Be a shame if something happened to her. Tom Martinez let out a strangled cry. They had his daughter. The demand was simple. Jake Sullivan for the girl. I have to go, Jake said. No, Grace said, her voice fierce. It's a trap. They'll kill you both. Then what do we do? Tom cried, his face a mask of agony. That's my little girl out there. Jake looked at the town ready to fight, but now crippled by this new horror. He made a decision that went against every odd. We attack, he said into the stunned silence. They expect us to wait, to surrender. We hit them first, while they're careless. We get Rosa back. It was a suicide mission, but 5 men stepped forward. Tom, Sam the bartender, Miguel Chavez, and 2 young ranchers. As darkness fell, they slipped out of the town, moving like ghosts through the dry washes. Garrison's camp was lax. They found the wagon where Rosa was being held, guarded by 2 drunken men. Jake and Tom moved in like shadows. The guards died without making a sound. Inside the wagon, Jake found Rosa, tied and gagged but unharmed. He cut her free. We're taking you home, he whispered. But as they slipped out, an alarm was raised. The camp exploded into a hornet's nest of shouts and gunfire. They ran, bullets whining past them in the dark. Jake carried Rosa, shielding her with his body. A man loomed out of the darkness, gun raised. Before he could fire, a rifle cracked from the shadows. Sam. They made it back to the town's barricades just as Garrison's men mounted a full-scale assault. The night exploded into chaos. The battle for Bitter Creek had begun. Jake had positioned his defenders well. The attackers rode into a brutal crossfire, but they were hired guns and they knew their business. They dismounted and fought back, the battle turning into a desperate street-by-street brawl. Jake was everywhere, directing fire, plugging gaps in the line, fighting with a cold, deadly fury. He saw a group of men with torches trying to flank the town, to set the buildings on fire. He led a charge to stop them, fighting hand to hand in the shadows. A bullet tore through his shoulder, but he barely felt it. He was back in the war, but this time he wasn't fighting for a flag. He was fighting for his wife, for his home, for the child he just rescued. He was fighting for a reason. Then as suddenly as it began, it was over. Garrison went down, a rifle shot from an unknown defender, finding its mark. With their leader gone, the hired guns broke and fled into the night. A ragged cheer went up from the barricades. They had held. The town had survived. As dawn broke, painting the bruised sky in pale colors, they counted the cost. They had lost 3 men. 7 more were wounded. Jake leaned against a wall, Grace trying to stop the bleeding from his shoulder. There was no celebration, only the grim reality of survival. But as Jake looked at the tired, bloodied faces of his neighbors, he saw something new. They weren't just a collection of strangers anymore. They were a community, forged in fire and blood. They had faced the darkness together and won. 5 years passed. Bitter Creek healed and grew. The schoolhouse Grace started was now the heart of the town, filled with children of all colors learning side by side. The scar on Jake's shoulder ached when the weather turned, a constant reminder of the price they had paid. The town was peaceful, prosperous. Jake and Grace had built a small house on the edge of town, a quiet life they had both thought impossible. Then one day a stranger arrived, a young woman exhausted and scared with familiar eyes. "I'm Sarah," she said. "I'm your sister's daughter, your niece." Jake hadn't heard from his family in 15 years. He had left to protect them from the man he was. Now his past had come knocking on his door. Sarah was running from an abusive husband, a man who saw her as his property. Mother always said if I was ever in real trouble, to find you, she said, tears in her eyes. She said you'd protect family. The old anger stirred in Jake. The old fight. A few days later, her husband, Robert Whitman, arrived with his two brothers. They were cruel men, bullies used to getting their own way. I'm here for my wife, Whitman said, standing in the middle of Main Street. She's not yours anymore, Jake replied, his voice quiet. And you're not taking her. Whitman laughed. You and what army? And then the army appeared. Tom Martinez and his ranch hands, Sam with his shotgun, the blacksmith with a hammer in his hand. Grace stood on the steps of the schoolhouse with Sarah beside her. The whole town. Whitman saw he couldn't win. He left, vowing to come back. And he did. That night, with a dozen hired guns. But Bitter Creek was ready. She's not your property, Sarah's own voice rang out in the darkness. I'm a person, and I choose to stay. Enraged, Whitman drew his gun. But Jake was faster. His shot sent Whitman's pistol spinning into the dust. The fight was short and brutal. When it was over, Whitman was on his knees, defeated. The old Jake would have killed him. But this Jake, the man Grace and Bitter Creek had helped create, saw another way. He made Whitman sign papers renouncing any claim on Sarah and sent him back east with a simple warning. If he ever came back, Jake would find him. And next time, they wouldn't have a conversation. As dawn broke over a safe and quiet town, Sarah hugged her uncle, finally free. Jake stood with Grace on their porch watching the sunrise. He had spent years running from his past, hiding from the killer inside him. But the world kept sending monsters to his door, and he had learned that you couldn't run from what you were. You could only choose what you fought for. He had fought for a stranger in a saloon. He had fought for a town of outcasts. He had fought for his family. And in doing so, the lonely soldier had finally found his peace. Not in solitude, but in connection. Not in running, but in standing his ground. He reached for Grace's hand. The war was never truly over. But now he had a reason to win. Thank you for listening to this story from the heart of the Wild West. If these tales of courage and survival speak to you, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and tell me what part of the world you're in. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories of the untamed frontier. What did you think of Jake and Grace's journey? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, stay safe out there, partners.